Good evening, everybody. I'm Tessa Gibbon. I'm the director of Talbot Rice Gallery. Really warm welcome. I suspect that a few of you were here for Charlotte Higgins last night. Can you raise your hands if you were, just so how I get... Wow, okay. Well, thank you for coming back. It's great to see you back again. And great that you were able to look at the exhibitions again, to engage with Nero Perig's artwork, The Cave of the Patriarchs, in which we witness this Kafkaesque exchange of space, changing from synagogue to mosque, which happens on the religious holidays in this really sacred site in Hebron in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's a very interesting way that she's able to access and bring images to us of the reality of that area. And then for you to have another look at Lara Barbaretta's momentary monument, the library, which for those of you who were here at the opening, you would have seen completely packed full with 2,400 odd 88 books that were all slated for demolition and have since been taken and disseminated around the world. And she's really interested in this destabilization of the idea of the permanence of a monument, and I think helps our thinking in that way. And then for you to also have another look at Qiu Zhijie's exhibition, which Charles is here to talk about tonight, in this kind of fragmented geopolitical world, and we can encounter the archaeological remains and his fantastical ideas of how we engage with and look at the surveillance of the world around us as well. So it is brilliant that you all came back. Thank you for being here. And by way of introduction, Charles Esche is the director of one of Europe's most significant museums, the Van Abbemuseum in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And he's Professor of Contemporary Art and Curating at Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts, London, where he works with exhibition studies. He's a visiting professor at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht and is chair of Casco in Utrecht. He's currently writing a book on de-modern thinking and preparing an exhibition project in the Netherlands, Indonesia and Australia, provisionally called The Four Soils for 2023 and 24. In June last year, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Edinburgh. At the end, assuming I time keep well, there's going to be time for questions. So please do hold them over. And otherwise, join me in welcoming Charles Esche.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to everyone for coming. It's so nice to see such a big group of people. And also thanks a lot to Tessa for the introduction. And also I have to say that I've lived in Edinburgh on and off, you could say, for 30 years this year. And so I know the Talbot Rice for all of that time, basically. And this does feel to be the most lively moment in Talbot Rice's history that I know over the last 30 years. I think you're doing an amazing job, and I think it's testament that all these people are here, not for me, but I think also very much for you. So it's very nice to be here and also to be able to contribute to that liveliness a little bit, I hope, with this talk. So I'm going to try and stick to 45 minutes, but also to talk about my relation with Qiu Zhijie. I thought it was interesting to personalize it a little bit and take you through the projects that I've worked with him, so that we can also see maybe the relationship between a curator and an artist, but also investigate a little bit what the lines are that connect some of those projects, because we've worked together for quite some time. And actually, the way things are these days with social media, this is, I think, when we met in 2012, which was 11 years ago now, in what's now called Kunstinstituut Melli, which used to be another name, which they got rid of, thankfully. And this was in that institution. This was really the first time I saw his work. And I think what's interesting is for people outside of China, the way that his work came to presence was very much through this mapping, this cartography, these fantastical maps. This was very much a way into his work. And I think for you, those of you that have seen the exhibition here, this is also a kind of introduction to the work, which is incredibly compelling, no? Because maps have this pull on our imagination. They have this way in which they construct a world within a world. They construct a kind of set of possibilities, an imagination of what it is to travel on that land which is depicted, represented on a small scale in the map, and what that then does to our thinking, placing ourselves in a way in the map. That's the invitation that a map gives, is where do you put yourself in? There's a Google map where you have that little figure that you drop in, and then you're suddenly on a one-to-one relationship with the environment. And the map also has always had that potential, really. Google just realized it technologically, but they didn't invent it. It was invented far earlier. And so this mapping, I think, is very much a perfect way, and the exhibition is really wonderful, also the way it's tailored to the spaces here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of his other work, as well as trying to think about the map, and take this journey really through our curatorial artistic relationship. This is one of the maps that I first saw from Kunstinstitut Melli. And look at a number of projects that we did leading up to a solo exhibition in 2017 in Van Abbe, which went to Geneva and Lund afterwards. So it was a kind of the first really major solo exhibition in Western Europe, which we could organize, and for Qiu Zhijie, and then take you through to the present, actually, and his presence in the collection in the museum now. I want to start actually with a quote from Qiu Zhijie that maybe is about his early life, maybe sort of indicates or starts to point out what I'll try to do in the talk, which is to pull out some of the connections, what we call in Dutch the red threads, that connect stories across his oeuvre, across the way that he's working. So this is a quote that we recorded in a conversation that we had in Van Abbe in 2017. I think it can be said as an idea of what the ideas are that are in his work. And one is the idea of disappearance, and that how that might lead to a certain form of reappearance in the world. Sorry. No, this is the quote. That's why. So this is the quote. When I was young, I lived close to the sea. I vividly remember I was fascinated by the waves. We often went to the beach, where I drew nice figures in the wet sand and kept watching until the water washed away my drawings. In our household, we were poor, and there was no money for paper or ink. I had already started calligraphy lessons at school. To be able to practice at home, I got a large, flat, dark grey stone and a cup of water. Every day I wrote the characters on the stone until it was full, and then watched how the sun dried the stone and made my attempts gradually disappear. And I think that this little quote points out not only the sort of origin of an artist. Now, I think this is something that's really familiar to many people. If there are artists in the audience, you might even recognize this kind of attempt to represent through any kinds of tools that are at hand, to draw without knowing what you're drawing and not really worrying about what it looks like, but somehow just the act of drawing itself becomes the way that you learn to understand the world. And I think that's when we see and think about Qiu's work. I think we understand how much it goes back to a sort of playfulness, these map making that you see here, but also other works, even though the subjects can be immensely serious, as we'll see in the course of the talk. But I think what we can draw from these quotes are two things that link many aspects of his work and keep on reoccurring in his practice. And one is this idea of disappearance, the disappearance of the calligraphy on the wet stone. And how this might later lead, and that's certainly in his work, if we look at the calligraphic work, which forms in some way the basis of his practice, how this might lead to a later reappearance. Because disappearance, I think in his case, always indicates the possibility of reappearance. It's like a potentiality which is there in something which is gone, but might come back. I think you even see that, we'll reference it later in the idea of archaeology and these archaeological fragments which emerge hidden from the ground, which are located underneath, unseen, disappeared, and then get uncovered again. And through that uncovering, they start to take a meaning in the here and now, rather than the meaning that they had when they were first deposited or lost or buried in the past. So this idea of disappearance and potential reappearance, I think, is very common to his work. And the other thing is that there's a strong relation to a tradition, but in a particular way. So this tradition, calligraphy we find here, is specific. It's geographically located. It's a Northeast Asian tradition largely. It also extends into Southeast Asia to some extent, but it's located in China, Korea, Japan. So this calligraphy in this case also stands for a kind of tradition, but a tradition that is not ossified. As we might say, traditions tend to be in other parts of the world, let's say for a moment. It's not ossified or reified. It's a tradition which also disappears, which also has mobility in it, which also has change. It does not become fixed as a symbol, but it becomes capable of movement. And I think that's what's so interesting about his reference to tradition, because it's not the reproduction of tradition, but it's tradition as a way of encountering the present, and how this relationship between past and present is maybe, and I think this is where another aspect of his work that's important but maybe slightly hidden underneath the layers, is how does it loop around between that tradition that existed, the present which it re-emerges in, changed, and the repetition that's also implied in that. Yeah? Because if we repeat tradition, we're also talking about repetition. If we maintain something, then we're repeating its presence in the world as the generations go through. And at the same time, it's constantly changing. So this idea of and I think this is where, a difference in mentality that we might begin to imagine or cultural difference, is the emphasis perhaps in Qiu's work, in its encounter with time, with the world, with getting older, with all these things that we all encounter, is one of sort of recognizing the loops and returns which are in that process. The idea of the cycle, which of course we have in the seasons. No, we've lost the sense of it, but this February is like last February in some ways. It's a return in certain ideas. There's no corona now, so there's also change, but there's change and return is part of the system. And I think the West tends to emphasize the idea of a teleology, sort of a development over time in which there's progress, an arrow of time. And that arrow of time that points always towards a mythical future for which the current suffering is worth it. It's written into the religions, into the Abrahamic religions, which we also have in the exhibition, written into the idea of modernity as a modernizing principle that reaches at some point a kind of utopia which is endlessly postponed. Written into ideas of communism and all those things which also affect, of course, China. But how does this relationship between return and change work out in the work? And I think that's very important to keep these ideas in as we're looking at his work. So I'm not going to be too long. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the projects that we did before the solo show, and then focus in on the solo show, just to give you an idea, perhaps also placing it rather curatorially. So I'm also talking about my own practice in a way in working with artists and putting them next to each other, which is, to some extent, in a simple way, what curators do. And in putting them together, seeing what the narratives are that emerge from that, rather like a sentence. If you put two words together, they add each to each other. So something changes in both of them, and also other things that are in that word fall away because they have a relation. So it narrows and it expands at the same moment. And so that's very much a sort of curatorial gesture. So I'm just going to go through some of the moments. So the first time that we really worked together was a couple of years later in 2014, when we worked in the Sao Paulo Biennale. And this is Qiu actually working. We'll have a little video later on of him painting. The remarkable thing is here, that most of this is done freehand. So he's painting one of these maps that you see. Here's another image of him working when it's a bit further along. And he's painting one of these images up on a ladder, basically freehand. The texts here are actually a kind of letraset, a sort of Brazilian version of letraset in some cases. A lot of the texts are simply handmade. But he basically spent about a week producing what ended up to be this diagram, this work. And what you see here is the first work that you would encounter in the exhibition. So perhaps here it's more easy to see that these are the entrances. You have the security gates with the checking for guns and things like that, because we're in Sao Paulo. And we tried to fight to remove those in the exhibition, but we couldn't because the elite there are so terrified that they have to have them, even though there's not really any need. But anyway, that's another story. But nevertheless, coming through there, you get through into this first work and this map, which you see here. I think here maybe it's interesting to see this map here. You start to see, if I can get the pointer up, you start to see, here he is. You start to see maybe something of the anthropomorphism that you also might spot upstairs in the exhibition, where some of these maps, actually if you zoom out from them, They ask you to go in. No, they ask you to engage in a kind of detailed look at reading these texts or using the torch and picking out the text in English here. But actually, if you zoom out, there's also something here. And here you can see a pair of legs. I noticed in the images upstairs that there's a sort of fist punching into a bay at a certain point that you see, which are all sort of elements of this map making, which we'll come back to, which start to sort of weave these narratives or these stories of possibility. What's our relationship between the body and the map? When you see these as legs, then you start to have a different relationship to it. Again, we're always thinking about this walking across the territory that the maps are indicated by, but also thinking of them as, okay, maybe they're embodied inside me, maybe they're maps of bodies. There's an interesting image which I'll show later on where he's done rather similar drawings of the palm of a hand and the undulations in the palm of the hand, marking these as valleys and marking these as rivers and things. So you can see this relationship between body and map making in the work quite intensely. So here you see this work, which was the first one you encountered, and I wanted to compare it with two other works that we had. This is by Prabha Pachput, who's from Mumbai, and well, actually from nearby, from a mining territory. And if we go from this sort of representation, which is embodied to some extent of the map, there are sort of two other big wall drawings which were also done directly on the wall. So all these three drawings within the Sao Paulo Biennale were a kind of sequence which unfolded from this first representation of the world as this fantastic map. And then you sort of zoom in on the sort of relation between body and landscape, which you see here, which is often a sort of an extracted landscape, and a landscape in which industry comes and extracts whatever value it can from that landscape and then leaves it abandoned. We know that from the slag heaps to the south here in East Lothian. I mean, all these environments are very familiar, I think, particularly to a place like Scotland, which has been extracted for, the last 300-400 years. So these sort of extractions that are happening in India in the present day are depicted here as being part of this relation to the map. So you hopefully read, having seen the map and seen the fantasies in the map, you maybe read it back to the kinds of ways in which we treat that earth, which is being depicted. Our relationship to this earth is also one of extraction, of exploitation. So suddenly these fictional maps, these maps of ideas, these maps of thoughts, these maps of concepts, also become things which, to what extent are we responsible for mining them, for extracting from them? And then in the end, we see this extraction coming out again in these figures, which are painted by Eder Oliveira, who's an artist from Belém in the far north of Brazil, a fairly poor area, fairly black area. Brazil is more or less economically and racially coinciding in terms of economic opportunity. These are figures of boys, basically, teenagers, who are arrested, and their pictures are put on the front of the newspapers as both a kind of warning but also an emphasis for those people that buy the newspapers, because the people who buy the newspapers at that time still works in the old-fashioned way to some extent in Belém, that this obviously also exists on the internet, but those people that are tuning in on the internet or buying the papers, because they can read and things like that, they're not really this class so much. They're another class. They're a class that needs to feel fearful of these people in order, to cut a whole loop short, to vote Bolsonaro, if you want to say that, in order to express their fear through a sort of right-wing politics. So what you have is this sort of process of the exploitation, extraction of the value of these boys' bodies in the same way that we have that happening with Prabhas in his drawings, and then makes you reflect maybe on the relationship between these as bodies, and as I say, this sort of embodied image that we might think about in the map itself, and how much these dialogues set up. So how do you complicate, in a way, the relationship between the map making, which seems to be on one level about a representation that we're quite familiar with. We all use Google Maps, and we also used to use paper maps, and you have a fascination for maps that are constantly there, and cartography. But how do we see this as also mapping, in a way? And how do we see the mapping as embodying values, embodying extraction? How does this relationship, this two-way relationship work? So that was what we were thinking about in sort of curating this exhibition, where we led through, alongside other works, these three large-scale wall paintings, all done essentially with the same medium, which is a person, an artist, standing in front of a wall and painting. all men, which you could question about whether that was a good choice, but that's another question. But nevertheless, it sort of represents also, I think, interestingly, 3 continents. Yeah? So you have Qiu from Beijing, Prabha from Mumbai, and Edda from Berlin. So you have this sort of these three continents being represented in this. So how this shift is happening. So just quickly, I think, because I don't want to be. Am I doing all right for time? 20 minutes or something? Yes. I'll go quicker. This is where, again, a sort of juxtaposition of works that we put together. 2 works that came out, actually, of Sao Paulo, but were shown in Porto and then also in Van Abbemuseum itself. And I won't go maybe too much into it. What you see here is that the drawings on the walls, of course, there's always a question of reproduction. No? So how do you then allow these drawings to be distributed, to traverse the world as it is, rather than the world in Qiu's head? And in this way, he started to produce wallpaper. So you can see these sort of wallpapers, which are printed on rice paper, actually, very thin. They're quite difficult to hang. But they have this extraordinary quality in themselves, even though they're prints. And these are the things that we've used for these works. And what you see in these installations, both in Porto here and in Eindhoven, is a central piece, which is a tree school developed by Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti, who are based now in Stockholm, but for a long time were based in Bethlehem, in Palestine. Again, coming back to the other connection. And what they were doing here was talking about, in a way, questions of migration through a children's book, which told the story in Brazil of the baobab tree, and here tells the stories of 2 foreign trees that are imported into Portugal and into the Netherlands. And this idea of how the children's story is about the tree desiring, in Brazil, the baobab tree, for instance, desiring to go back to Africa where it's from. It comes probably in the slave boats as a sort of little nut or so, and then gets distributed. And then how does it wants to go back to Africa, and eventually in the story it gets its desire, so it flies. So you have this flying tree which flies back to Africa, but then it lands in Africa and it puts its roots in the soil, and the soil isn't as sweet as the soil in Bahia in Brazil, and the weather and the sun is a bit hotter than the one in Bahia, and everything, and the water isn't quite as sweet, and everything is sort of slightly worse. So then they say, oh no, I want to go back now to Bahia. I've had enough of being home, I want to go back. And this sort of, in the end, this tree just is suspended between these 2 locations, like not knowing where it wants to go, and it sort of hovers there. And this hovering is what's captured in the installation, and the books that you can see on the little chairs tell this story. So we thought this would be interesting to think about. So what territory is this tree flying over? What land is it surveying when it's sort of moving, trying to find home here from there and being displaced everywhere? And here you see the maps that surround it in these images. Hopefully give you a sense of what that territory might be. And it's an imaginative territory. Of course, it's a territory of projection. It's a territory which includes the kind of terms, I hope you've seen the exhibition, but it might include the isms of art, the isms of politics, the disciplinary divisions of science. It might include the value systems of different religions. All of these things are marked as geographic terrains in these works. So now I'm going to move on to the exhibition itself, which was done in 2017, as I say, and toured in Europe until 2019, actually. So it went through a few venues, including Geneva and Lund, Kunsthal Lund in Sweden. And I'm going to start a little bit by again referring to this idea of looping, but also of disappearing that we have here. So on the right is the work that you have here as it was installed with us, and you'll see that we were, I think, less environmentally conscious at the time. So what we did was build a whole platform, a wooden platform, so that you could look down into them. But actually what you see is I think, a lot of wood, which, we tried to recycle later, but probably weren't that successful with, because it's not that easy. So I actually respect a lot the way that it's installed here, which feels more sympathetic to the world. But it was nevertheless a nice way of sort of encountering this very dark space which is created here with these light bulbs, as we have here, that illuminate these archaeological works. I'll come back to that in a bit, but I want to refer to this also because it's quite remarkably similar to the Ionic columns that we have all around, not all around the room actually, only here, interestingly. These are Ionic. There's 2 ionics at the back as well. So what you see here is the kind of, is it Ionic or is it Doric? Yeah, it's Ionic, isn't it? The Dorics are the simple ones, no? Yeah. It's so, and they're Corinthian. So this is my orders that I remember as an art history student if there are any here. But you see here how this Ionic column, which is called representative of a sort of classical set of values. Yeah. So for somebody who's growing up in Beijing, they're values which are, as distant, I suppose, as the traditions of the Chinese kingdom and of the emperor in the center of Beijing. But at the same time, they're those values which actually sort of make up the economic transformation that went through Qiu's lifetime. So, he was born in 1969, so still in the Cultural Revolution, still in this process in which society was being remade in the model of Mao Zedong. We'll come back a little bit to that moment as well. And by the time he's working as an artist, these values are represented in this Ionic column, which, to some extent become capitalism and westernization, in his mind, that these things start to be very dominant. But what happens to this column, you see, is really beautiful. And in a way, again, sort of brings past and future and present together. That this column falls apart or disappears. So this ends up being hovering here and, completely unsupportable in a way. All the weight is at the top. And what's holding it up is almost nothing. And so it touches the ground. So if you think about this metaphorically as an image, then I think I don't have to unpack it for you, I don't think. You start to see what happens to this top, or where's the sustainability here of the structure itself. Yeah, it's broken, it's fragmenting as we watch. And so I want to then talk through the exhibition and take you a little bit through it. And this was the first room which really established his own life, his own practice. It's called My 100 Objects, and it's 100 objects that he selected which told something about his life. And we asked him actually to do this because we're working in a Northwest European context, a different context from here, absolutely, but nevertheless one that has more relations than the relation with Beijing. And we wanted to bring an idea of who Qiu was as a person, as an artist, what experiences he'd gone through, such as the Cultural Revolution that we talked about, in order to hopefully get people to step over some of the cliches which might exist in a situation like the Netherlands of a Chinese artist coming here, and he even makes reference to it at one point. So as we see here, I'm going to isolate 2 objects because we don't have time to go through all 100, I promise. But what we're looking at here is a display of each object, and each one has, you can see beside it, a longish text which really tells about it. And we're going to zoom in on 2 of those texts. Before that, I'm going to show you this, which is a map which is called Trying to Understand My Own Art, and is one of the early maps, actually, that he made, which was sort of, again, reflecting back on himself. So he was looking in this map. We can't really see so many of the terms because the projection doesn't work, and it would need a whole unpacking of this map alone would take in the lecture. But if you can imagine this Trying to Understand My Own Art being a way of sort of self-mapping, of understanding where his art comes from. What its relationships are. So the things that we've been talking about, from calligraphy and tradition to this disappearance and appearance to this relation between the map and the body, all these things come back in this project, as well as this concept of total art that I'll talk in a minute. Now these are 2 of the labels that go alongside the object. And the first object relates to that Cultural Revolution when he's born. So this is the People's Daily on the day that he was born. I'll show you another image of it. But I was born at noon on November 6, 1969, in the yard of a Catholic church in an old town by the sea in Jiangpu County, Fujian Province. On the People's Daily that day, the front page article was taking the lead in studying and using Mao Zedong thought smartly is the highest responsibility of a cadre. So I think something that you can remember as a headline quite easily. On page 4 is a photo report on the revolutionary modern Peking opera, The Taking of Tiger Mountain, which is actually quite a famous opera at this point. The most interesting part is quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong on page 3. Let philosophy be free from the philosopher's class, and books transform into sharp weapons in the hands of the masses. which I think some philosophy professors here might also still want to apply in certain senses. But it's interesting that that's the environment in which he's born. Yeah, it's an environment in which that is a headline in the daily newspaper, which is put, on those newspaper boards. If you remember some of your Chinese history, that was stuck in most villages to be read communally. And the next one across there is really a little joke. It's from much later, so it's 46 of the objects, and it's a lithograph called Double Happiness, which is also a brand of cigarettes, but also a sort of good luck charm. Often at New Year, you have this symbol of double happiness. This is a lithograph made in 1990 or 91 for a studio class. So this was when he was in the academy. At that time, I was not aware that artists in Beijing were making similar paintings. It must have been the pervasive social atmosphere in Beijing after 1989, and of course Tiananmen Square. Whoever was skilled in the realist style and felt the atmosphere of oppression would instinctively create paintings like this. You can see it a little bit. If I were in Beijing then, because he was working elsewhere, I may have built myself a reputation as a pop artist because of this painting. It did not happen, which was probably a good thing. Which I think, if you know anything about the phenomenon of pop art and a sort of use of socialist realist tropes within painting in the 1990s, which became quite famous in the market. There are many artists who were working like that. It's quite interesting because actually he would probably be far richer now if he'd gone down that road in a certain way, but also he wouldn't have been able to develop at all. Yeah, so this whole thinking that I'm talking about was simply stopped by this very formalist idea of representing China as a sort of pop art, socialist, realist utopia in a way, in an ironic way. So an ironic application of socialist realist tenets which were taught in the academies during the Cultural Revolution. This, just to say, is the actual paper from when he was born, and on the other wall is the lithograph that he made, which is about this size. Now, if we go through the exhibition, I'm not going to take through all the rooms. I might have to skip a couple. But we look here at the start, I think, of the work is this interest in calligraphy as a form of mark making. Yeah? And I think that learning of calligraphy, which is very different from learning to write. I see there are some Chinese students possibly in the audience. I know there's one anyway. It's, calligraphy has a completely different relationship to the hand and to movement and to the breath and to the body than does the idea of drawing itself. And we organized some calligraphic classes during the exhibition in order to sort of experience this difference. So calligraphy becomes a kind of, philosophical moment. It's also a part of how you exist in relation in the world, yeah? How you create your relation to the paper, to the mark making, to symbols, to language, but also to your body and to your hand and to the way that movements are conducted, your muscles. All this is part of the training and the engagement with calligraphy, and there are different styles which represent different philosophical positions. I'm not going to do a whole lecture about calligraphy, but this is sort of written into this. What's interesting about these, I don't know if anybody can read them. I can't read them, I have to admit. But both of these, I'm told, represent a cycle, again this sort of looping, this repetition, a cycle of representation, often to the emperor, sometimes to another powerful person, sometimes really revolutionary calls to action, every 200 years around in Chinese history, where, and this is how it was explained to me by Qiu, that these are moments when the inequality that's built up over the previous 200 years gets cut and chopped and flattened. And that this cycle, I mean the 200 years is approximate, no? But this cycle of the building of inequality and then a moment of revolutionary turmoil which flattens that inequality and then allows it to build again, I think is a fascinating way of thinking about our histories and even our current state at the moment and where we are on that cycle. I'm not going to point out necessarily, but you can probably imagine where I think we are. But nevertheless, that process of returning every 200 years starts to give us a different sense than the modernist teleology, the arrow of history, which endlessly projects into a utopian future. Okay, this is like we're around I don't know, whatever it would be, 320 degrees of the 360 maybe, until the whole thing comes around again. Yeah, so that would be the discussion that we might have. That would be a kind of public discussion. Where are we exactly on this cycle? And when is the moment going to be? And what can we do? Can we make it a bit less violent this time? A bit less uncomfortable? A bit less destructive? What can we do? Suddenly there'd be different questions. And how are we going to improve everything while everything gets worse? Which is the experience mostly in my lifetime, I have to say. Now, this idea of a kind of a turn and a change is also countered by this disappearance of, in this case, his own body, but often of objects or of memories, and how maybe there's a way of recapturing them. I'm just going to point out this one work, which is one of the works that he was most famous for, partly because of its transgressive nature. So you can see his naked torso here. Now already that nudity, this is produced in the late 1990s, that nudity in China is already to some extent transgressive. But then to put on top of that nudity, particularly the one on the left, which represents the character Bu, which is no, and then you can see the more familiar sign to us, yeah, the sort of no, the cancellation, the no entry or whatever on the right-hand side. That these characters are sort of, to put a calligraphic character onto a naked body is also a sort of transgression in itself. So there's a double transgression, both the representation of the body and the treatment of calligraphy in a disrespectful way. And then at the same time, this idea of no, which of course is what the reaction might be of people that would see it within the context of the image of the torso. Yeah, so how this then feeds back into a sort of loop with the public, who is saying no, and he's going, yeah, well, the work's saying no. So we agree, but we don't agree. But how do we come out of that loop? Yeah, how do we have a dialogue with ourselves when it's sort of confirming our own prejudice, which maybe we want to try and overcome? And the dots, I think, again represent a kind of similar sort of screen or surface in front of the body. And here another work. Which has which is just called Object, actually, and is again about disappearance and appearance, but in a very sort of tangible way. Because what these are 4 of the places that Qiu lived in his life, from his grandparents' house through to his current apartment. You can maybe make out, I don't know, you can see if I can find a pointer again. You can see a kind of a shower head and a shower fitting there, which is probably the more recent one. Yeah? And so what he's doing here is walking around these apartments and striking a match. And every time he strikes a match, he holds it up and illuminates an object until the match goes out. And so you have these sort of moments in which there's a nice sort of Benjamin quote about memory being something that flashes up at a moment of danger. And this sort of idea of the flash of memory being a sort of a light that shines for a moment in the darkness. Actually very much referring, I think, to this idea of how memories disappear and then suddenly reappear. Yeah, how they go underground, like rivers sometimes go underground and then reappear hundreds of miles later on. And this is this sort of appearance and disappearance, very metaphorically devised. The next work, which actually came into a collection, which I'll finish on, is a very sort of poetic title. The thunderstorm is slowly approaching. I think you can also read that a little bit with that calligraphy that I saw earlier in terms of this idea of what this thunderstorm is. But in this case, it's very much, again, about hiding, again, about this idea of the appearance and reappearance. And I want to focus a little bit on this work, which came into the collection. If you can look closely, you'll actually see that there's a painting on top of the camouflage. I can't find the pointer here. You see, you can't actually see the pointer because of the camouflage. But there's a painting that is here, which I hope you can see, which is sitting on top of the wallpaper. And above it, you see this rather beautiful Chinese dragon. And we can maybe talk about this later, but it's essentially about the way that Chinese diasporic communities in a way camouflage themselves in their community, often aren't present in the way that some other communities can be very present in the public sphere. But one of the moments that they emerge is Chinese New Year and the celebrations around Chinese New Year. And he was observing this by being in New York, by being in Berlin, by being in Warsaw, by being in different major cities where these Chinese communities existed. And of course, he had access to them in a way, in an obvious way. and then developed this Chinese dragon, which, as I say, we'll refer to later. But this Chinese dragon became then a kind of representation of this camouflaging and the combination of appearing, of disappearing and appearing, because the appearance is in the Chinese New Year. So this was used for Chinese New Year festivals. So kind of again, it's a bit of a twist of your mind. Yeah. So why are you camouflaging the thing that's the one moment you want to appear in? Or how does that relationship unpack? You see here on the right a painting which also has painting on the wall, and there's a nice little video here. It's only 1 minute, so I hope I can show it, which actually shows you a little bit of the confidence and the ability which I think comes with that calligraphic training. And you see here, it's just using an iPad. There's no pencil drawing or anything going on. There's a marvellous moment when he makes this huge gesture, which of course once you've done it, you can't remove it. Here. Which I think really, it shows the kind of confidence to be able to do that in the context of just a wall that you're painting, which is really beautiful. So this was the result, the painting behind. And this was very much part of our sort of discussions in the Netherlands, actually, because this is a Frisian Qiu, they say, a Frisian cow. He said Qiu here as well, actually. And these are bred, and it's interestingly, they're not only bred for mainly milk production, but they're also bred in terms of their attractiveness of their skin. Because also for the farming community, they want to have a nicely camouflaged, you could say, Frisian Qiu in order for it to look good in the photographs of the Dutch landscape and things like that. There's a sort of twistedness around that idea, of course, but actually quite interesting. And then, of course, the way that this cow, has been processed so much through the generations of genetic manipulation. So the Frisian Qiu, the cow, doesn't represent in any way a kind of an original form of the beast. The Highland Qius that you have here are much closer, so you can see the difference in appearance is dramatic. And obviously this is a different species, but nevertheless that breeding and processing, which has gone on for generations, which goes back before genetic manipulation was ever might have been thought of, but they didn't have the possibility to do it, and produce this particular cow, which is, probably completely, if we think about a sort of a healthy, sound relationship between the organs in this cow's body and its own life, it's completely distorted, no? Because it is simply a machine for milk production, and everything else, its own integrity as an animal, is completely removed and forgotten. And so therefore it becomes with this sort of barcode, which is also a kind of camouflage. And also you see these sort of camouflage upon camouflage, which is what he's talking about. But always this idea of hiding. So is the cow hiding behind the Frisian cow? Is there something that's camouflaged, it camouflages, which is some essence of cow inside of it? And that was quite interesting to think about. We even talked with some Frisian farmers who are now very unpopular in the Netherlands. Because of this, and what does the cow represent, and also their own relationship to the cows, which of course, once you talk to farmers, it's completely different. You unpack a whole other series of relationships to animals, which most of the modernist city inhabitants simply have lost touch with. So also this idea of the cow as a kind of simply a machine breaks down at the moment, at the interface of the human-cow interface. That whole idea breaks down, but nevertheless is what's transmitted largely through the sort of milk production system. Going on to a couple of other projects, and I suppose the point of the exhibition was very much to show a diversity of the work. So I hope you're getting a bit of an idea here of what the kind of range of practice in terms of an artistic practice Qiu has. No, the extent to which he's constantly thinking about what he wants to, not even say necessarily, but what fascinates him. What are the conditions of compulsion in his experience of the world, and how can he then translate that in some way into something which makes sense? And then it's about grabbing the material that most appropriately translates that sense of need, in a way, sense of urgency. I think that goes back to his description as a child of obsessively almost drawing on the stone, and this work somehow feels like it emerges out of a need for him to do that sort of drawing, but then what's the material that actually makes sense? So here you see a very different kind of material, because he wants to relate again to tradition. So the what we see in this, maybe we see it a little bit better here, in this vitrine, is a copy of the Colourful Scroll, as it's called, which is from the Lantern Festival in Shangyuan. And the Jingling Chronicle is a chronicle of this Lantern Festival, which is one of the biggest celebrations in Southeast China, and which during the Ming Dynasty, and which sort of represents a particular moment of communal celebration, almost a little bit like a carnival. This carnival idea, the idea that we have also in some Catholic traditions anyway in Western Europe, of the world turned upside down for a day, of being able to, the king of the carnival is not the king for the other 364 days of the year. So this kind of idea of the Lantern Festival also was this sort of coming together of all classes and all classifications and professions of beings. And what he's done is he's translated it in this. We don't really have time to go into it, but if you see this scroll at the very back here, this is a kind of contemporary translation that he's made of the Colourful Scroll from Nangyuan. So how does that play out? There are some moments which are almost direct copies, some moments which are totally transformed. There's an idea of technology coming in. Technologies which we know from today, or technologies which are even sort of imagined for a future, which suddenly sort of enter into this 14th century image. But also it brings it in a way up to date with the classifications and the class and the castes systems which are being brought together in this image, but they're being brought together today. So there are people from Europe and from the United States and from Australia and from India and are suddenly present in this celebration. Yeah, suddenly there's a sort of global China which is represented by this, a change from the Colourful Scroll where it's only homogeneous Chinese people. So this sort of relationship is there, and also there are certain drawings or certain inventions in a way, which he then also expands on the opposite wall here into a series of drawings which are almost Leonardo da Vinci in their kind of inventiveness, in creating different kinds of machinic fantasies. And then some of these are then realized in actual reality. So for instance, this is very beautiful, almost like a Borges instrument. It's an instrument which you can push along and the earth, and at the same time you can draw a map. So basically the map making is a one-to-one map making. It's a map making which, as you push along, this machine at the top draws the lines which you're walking along, and therefore eventually produces the map. And it's again, you see, making reference, although formally completely different, again to what this map making is and what a one-to-one map is, what a perfect map of the world, which is that Borges story of making the map that's the most accurate map can only be a map which is one-to-one. But the problem is that then it excludes all the sun, because once you open it up, you can't see anything else but the map. So then you have a sort of problem that you can never reach this perfection of map making. And this kind of then plays with some of these ideas as well from other continents and other ideas. Or here is an interesting one because it relates very much to his own history, but also even to contemporary politics. It's called Powerful Minister. And you can probably see the idea of a powerful minister who's, you can push over, but you can never knock down. Yeah, it's kind of, I'm a generation that remembered Weebles in the United Kingdom, which were these kind of toys that you could buy, which would never fall down. And then you see this sort of basically Mao suit, or this sort of proletarian dress, which the powerful minister is covered in, this grey dress here. And then above it, you see a chandelier for a head or for a sort of celebration. So again, this sort of tension between the wealth that's implied in a way by the chandelier and the class system which is implied by who would have a chandelier in their house, and then this covering of a sort of proletarian kitsch in a way, or radical chic, you could say, in a certain way, which is coming into this work. And then, of course, what happens in this process is that the wax covers. So we lit the candles, and then the wax covers the Mao suit. So again, you see this sort of that the two can't live together. No, the two can't. It's unsustainable. Often a bit like the column. This unsustainable relationship between what's up and what's down. Now then, how long? Because 1 minute. This is going back a little to the maps, and I think we spoke quite a lot about the maps. But the interesting thing I think about this work is these feet, these bamboo feet. So bamboo, which is a native Chinese material. These bamboo feet, which are here walking out the door. Here you can see them again, and perhaps here is the best image. And these bamboo feet are baskets which contain fruit and vegetables, which are all, you can perhaps here see some pineapples. These are all fruits that are not indigenous to China, to this vast country, but nevertheless, these fruits are not indigenous, even though they've all become almost completely integrated into the Chinese diet. So there's no consciousness of them being foreign anymore, but they actually originate elsewhere, out with the kingdom, out with the republic. So these sort of flying feet, in a way. Remember, we go back to the sort of flying tree and this sort of displacement and what this means, and how do we take account of it? We have ourselves tomatoes and potatoes as things that feel so fundamental. They cause massive famines in the north of this country in the 19th century, and yet they're also imported. They also don't exist without the exchange of goods, but also without the colonial system which brought them here. So this sort of ambiguity of this idea of moving, and also moving in bamboo, which is the only indigenous element of these works, I think becomes very interesting in relation to this embodiment of the maps that I was talking about. So when I say that a map is a projection of a space that you can project yourself into, that you can walk through, and you're in a way invited to, because a map is also meant to tell you the way, so you're meant to use the map in order to physically travel the roads which are represented on it. That's the fundamental function of a map. You're meant to experience it in 3 dimensions by looking at it and saying, oh no, we need to go down that road. And at the same time, you're sort of confronted with this idea of what is movement in itself, and what does it represent, and the ambiguities of that. And it's not clear, because Chinese cuisine would be far poorer if there weren't these vegetables available. And at the same time, it represents a kind of for a essentialist nationalist or whatever, they would sort of represent something that was foreign and therefore, inadequate to the narrative of the nation and things like that. So all those ideas are sort of in your head, like, but what would it mean if there were no pineapples anymore here? How could we call ourselves? Could we call ourselves pure if we get rid of the pineapples? And why would we do this? And this is more anecdotal. This is actually Qiu's daughter who came to the opening as well, and one of the most beautiful maps, which is one of the paintings that he produced. And here you see again something of the sort of anthropomorphic aspect of this planning, only vaguely there, but it's there in the kind of face that's possibly there, or the profile. I think I'll skip over this because it goes into the archaeology a bit, which we see here. And I suppose I wanted to say a little bit about the archaeology to conclude, because I think that there's an element in which he's this uncovering of the archaeology, I think, is it's quite a sort of megalomaniac project. Yeah? If you look at these things in the archaeological in the images, because they contain both huge structures, huge archaeological structures, which are sort of miniaturized and then buried in the earth, and then tiny little animals which are also blown up to exist somehow in relationship to them. But it's also a kind of totalizing world. I think it becomes like everything has already been buried. And I think that's already interesting to think about, that maybe it's asking us a little bit that where we are going is as much in our past as it is in our future. There is an accounting for the past that maybe is more necessary than an accounting for the present or the future, or an accounting for the past in the present. We can kind of forget the future. I think this talks about that. The relationship between past and present is far more dynamic in his work then I think this relationship, which is often true of modernist Western artists, of relationship between present and future. So this mapping there becomes, the archaeology becomes particularly crucial. And I think this is he speaks about in a text from original Chinese is from about 2005, but it wasn't translated till 2012, and it's called On Total Art. And in that text, he talks about understanding our current condition as one characterized by division. Which I think you see here, the divisions which are in the different categories of the archaeological dig, but also between them, these animals that exist alongside everything. So he characterizes it by division with fragmented cultural values, the individual divided from social obligation, which is very important, goes back to Confucius' thinking about the responsibility of the individual, but also Mao's teachings. Physical labor separated from creation, art divided from life. And he sees these as symptoms of a spiritual illness. And to treat this disease, he's talking about, and I think this is where the maps are so important, he's talking about how to rebuild connectedness and interdependence. And there's a key element of interdependence in the work. And what I want to finish with, I'm going to skip through these, is the final presentation in the Abbemuseum of this work, which we talked about, which I think I described about the videos which actually show the people in, I think we can see it here, in this case in New York, Chinatown, using the camouflage dragon as part of the New Year celebrations, as part of the New Year parade. And what I found really interesting is that this work in our museum, and this is on now if you come to Eindhoven, is juxtaposed with a work by Celine Condorelli, who was also here very recently as well. So the kind of juxtaposition that you did in time, we do in space here, thinking about, and this is where I suppose I come to this idea of interdependence, which I hope you can read back a little bit also into some of the other works. You see here, just in the background here, you see a sort of wire snake, basically, that's coming from the previous room. In the previous room is a work by a Northern Australian indigenous group called the Caribbean Film Collective. And that snake is coming through the room to meet the dragon, the camouflage dragon from China, together with the plants that are a projection of a portrait that Celine Condorelli has made of a friend of hers in plant material, this relation between the human and the plant. And then also with two sculptures which resemble the human body, one from Osip Zadkin, who's a Russian, French-based Russian artist, from the early 20th century, and Omama, who only recently died and is from Papua New Guinea, and whose work is traditionally shown in world culture museums or ethnographic museums, or they used to be called colonial museums. And so this sort of bringing together of these aspects of the cultures of China, the cultures of Europe, the cultures of Papua, the cultures of classical modernism from the West, actually how these might come together in some kind of interdependence, recognition of interdependence in the exhibition, but also I think in Qiu's work itself is a crucial element of where we are going. And in the end, I want to conclude just with a little quote from him from that text about the total art, on total art, where he said, "Every system tends to become rigid. Any language or culture tends towards being employed without effect, by people belonging to its linguistic and cultural realms." In other words, that things lose meaning. Meaning disappears. When the core of what we're talking about in this disappearance and reappearance is the loss of linguistic power, of being able to say something. And that really rang a bell for me around where we are today. If we think about the kind of social media discourses that are going on. That it's exactly that we're employing without effect linguistic and cultural realms. And I think that what he's saying is in that cyclical moment, we might try and come back to something like this, but we also might try to come back to meaning. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, Charles. And that last image of the snake coming through the wall, it's really an image of curating a storytelling, isn't it? And pulling these things together.
Absolutely.
I realize that neither of us actually introduced his biography. So, also, Qiu Zhijie is an educator. He's vice principal of CAFA in Beijing. And Charles and I were discussing earlier, how does that ability to work on the inside, so if you compare to someone, and in the press he has often compared to someone like Ai Weiwei, What is the difference? What is the agency that he can have, within China as a teacher and as this international artist that you've described so well?
Yeah, I think it's. He's also a curator as well. There are whole other lectures that could be given about him, or we could be here 2 hours. So I had to sort of concentrate in talking about him on my relationship to him, because that felt the only way of actually distilling it. But I think that I think that there's a danger in something like Ai Weiwei of what I would call a kind of performative radicalism, which is a radicalism that's performed for a public which is not the one that supposedly is being addressed. And I think the difference between what Qiu does and what Ai does to some extent is that it lies in there. I don't think Qiu is ever performative when he's talking to his students about Tiananmen Square, for instance, which happens and is not forbidden or whatever. There's also a performative control that the Chinese state issues, which is also different from the kind of things that happen at certain levels. Now it's got worse. There's a narrative in China which is about increasing repression, and that seems to be, for what I know, but there are Chinese people here I know, might be is something to consider and to bear in mind. So Ai Weiwei is not wrong necessarily in his attacks, but I think that there's a relationship that Qiu would say, which is that I feel I'm doing the hard work and not doing the performative aspects of that, and that's in trying to project backwards, I think, to other futures, rather than to imagining that the model is simply the adoption of the West. Because we look at what's happened with Russia, with its so successful adoption of the Western model since 1991. I think if we just look at our own history, we might know that what's happening in China, deserves some kind of relationship of, criticality, but also of respect. And that's, I think, where Qiu would position himself. And to be honest, I'm quite in agreement with it. I'm a little bit sick of performative radicalism in that sense. Yeah.
I'm just going to limit myself to one more question before we throw it open to you. But James and Melissa are both in the middle here. If you let them, either of them, know that you have a question, and it's also to do with you as a museum director, having acquired his work and your ability to disseminate it. He seems to be. How did you put it earlier? That he has found an ability to traverse the world as it is rather than in his head through these forms of dissemination. And it feels like he's been conceiving this very democratic ability to disseminate his work from the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that he makes that quote about philosophy from Mao Zedong at the beginning without a critical or without an ironic gesture to it. It's saying this is the paper when I was born, and on page 4 we had this quote from Mao Zedong, which is actually quite interesting. And I think you could say that despite the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, and let's not gloss over that, but there are horrors that are produced by any system, including the system that we cherish in a situation like the British Empire, if you like, which we're standing in now. That process is one that I think can be. It's about this relation to the past, no? Is the past that has a potentiality to be useful for the present, or are we just going to condemn everything and say that what we don't know, or what we know elsewhere, we can implement here, and we can forget about it? And I think that's partly the idea of where his democratic idea of dissemination comes from. No? It's like reading that history in a way that creates possibility without denying the sides of it that are problematic. And I think that's quite interesting if we think about, even the talk yesterday around the question of monuments and how do we deal with those histories. Like, how can we, what are the registers that we can find to address the possibility that are in some of those histories for us today? And some things need to be cancelled, some things need to be deleted, but also some things maybe need to be reshaped or re-understood, and the possibility found within them. And I think that's a very hard conversation to have, because immediately you're faced with a kind of self-righteous condemnation of almost the whole of history for somebody. No? And that's also not necessarily constructive. I can understand it, I can sympathise with it, I can even agree with it in many ways. Yeah, the relation to coloniality, for instance, here is something that's very difficult to deal with. But what would we do about the British Empire here today that would actually make a difference to how we might think about it in the future. You know, I could think of a few things like independence, but it would also be that what would we do about those histories in China or in India or in the Netherlands, which has also an equally dark relationship to modernity.
And when you have so many items in the collections that are set and monumental in their own way, and yet you're able to acquire works of an artist which you own the means to the reproduction, does it change the way that you feel that an artist like Qiu Zhijie is able to, you know, evolve and revolve in his practice as it spreads around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really interesting. The works that we showed of where Sandy and Sandy Halal and Alessandro Petti's Flying Tree was put in this sort of environment of the maps. I mean, that was really just a curatorial conceit in a way, you know, just to say, okay, these relationships could be there. And, you know, I sent some pictures to Qiu. I hope he looked at them. I'm not sure he reacted, certainly not to both of them. So it was kind of that his work then exists, and I think he's very happy to hand out that responsibility and to say, okay, do what you want with it. You know, there's a great there's a great quote actually from Liszicki, who's also in our collection, where he says, "I don't have to do it, you can do it," in response to somebody talking about his art and his proposition in his art. And I think Qiu is the same. You know, it comes from a certain socialist democratic idea that actually it's about generating a possibility. Even in some US formulations of conceptualism, you can see it. It's we can hand over this idea of authorship in order to, because we think the idea is actually the valuable thing that can be transmitted. And I think that that's where Qiu stands.
Thanks for the talk, Charles. We were really sort of influenced by a paper that you put out in about 2017 called Demodernizing a Possibility, which was really about rethinking institutions and trying to decenter them and give a platform for other voices and other histories. And I just wondered if in the last 5 or 6 years and since Documenta, how your ideas about demodernizing might have evolved or changed.
That's a whole lecture, you know. That's really a difficult. I mean, they've certainly evolved, but it's interesting that I was talking. I had the introduction to the exhibition, and I said this. So this may be interesting just to reflect on it. I said. I was talking about some of his work and the elements of tradition, and I was saying, as I spoke about, that it's tradition which is in motion. Yeah? And I said, this is how tradition will also keep their relevance for the future. As such traditions wax and wane, their greater importance is whether they're able to come back as a reaction to social change and reflect shared predicaments back upon the people experiencing them. So how can we now, experiencing those traditions from the past, put them into motion? In this way, Qiu moves on from the old demand to separate sources and break with the past proposed by Western modernism towards a recycling of ancient ways of thinking for a decolonizing, demodernizing global cultural present. I'm not sure I'd use the word global anymore, so that's also interesting. But I think that idea of demodernizing, to break with this tradition, the teleology that I spoke about, is something that's become very important. We're also working together on an attempt to demodernize kind of architectural thinking as well, because that's even more than art. Sometimes I think architecture is stuck in this idea of the modern, also in always looking for new forms, you know. And it's really, I suppose, when I was talking about the relation to the past as being a more fruitful conversation that we could have with our present than this projection always to the future. I see that the projection to the future, which belongs to the colonial. No, the colonial imagination, imaginary, was this idea that there will be a land somewhere else which will be able to solve all our problems. So it's written into the colonial, and the modern, as a philosophical, as a rhetorical, as a political endeavor, I'm not talking about technology, follows the colonial. It's dependent upon and it follows the colonial. It has no separate existence, I would see. So if we to decolonize, we have to demodernize at the same time, and those relationships are crucial. We have to decolonize in the world. I think we have to demodernize particularly in Western Europe or in the Anglo-Saxon territories. So that process is one I think that we're still engaged in, yeah, and it's sort of expanding, and its dialogue with decoloniality as the kind of the big brother is very important, and how we relate that. But it's a long story. But I think it's absolutely key, and within our little territory, within art history, to demodernize the stories of modern art in order to include not only other geographies, other practices, other genders, other processes of expression is super important, because otherwise we're stuck in a negative loop when we're always looking to the future to solve ourselves.
Hi. Now I can't tell whether I want to ask you about demodernizing architecture or my original question, but I'll stick with the original question, which is actually quite it's quite rooted in the image that's on show in the galleries, but also some of the work that you're showing throughout the shows at the Fanaba. And it's really a question about your discussions with Qiu and in relationship to the concept of land or even landscape. Because when I'm struck by these imaginary cartographies, these are landscapes as well, but also the kind of quasi-archaeological works that it's about the ground, which is also about the land, and there's a very ambivalent nature, I think, around various technological or modernized approaches to engaging with the land and landscape, and it seemed to be a kind of powerful theme that I could see running through the work, and kind of a theme that might be united by this idea of a survey. There's a survey map, but also kind of a survey as a kind of horizontal, embedded ground survey. And so really it's a quite open-ended question to just ask you to reflect on that, or if that theme had come up in your work with Qiu as land and landscape, and how one understands that today.
Yeah, I mean, I think I maybe didn't bring it out enough. I tried to talk about it a little bit at the beginning when we talked about Sao Paulo and this shift from the representation to the landscape in Prabaja's work, and then to the figures. And I think that I talked very much about extraction there, but I think also you could talk about this slow zooming in on a landscape, which ends up on the human face. And I think what's actually interesting is to see the embodiment of landscape, which I did talk about, as also being part of getting your feet dirty in a way. Yeah? The relation to the soil, not only the ground but to the soil, is I think there in his work. You can also see it in some of the colourings of the map as well, which are quite browns and greens and blues. They're sort of the colours of the earth, actually. So I agree with you, and I could probably have drawn that also as a red thread through some of the work. I think it's there, but I think it's also something that's implied by his relationship to tradition. So I think that where maybe the reason I don't so much focus on it is because of the Western tradition of landscape is one that sort of blocks us seeing this relationship. So you probably know about scroll painting and those traditions of how you depict landscape. Which I think is also interesting because they're often read from top to bottom, and you have also this, the relation between the column and the bottom of the column. You could read in terms of a vertical reading rather than this left to right reading, which is in our DNA essentially as Christian tradition people. So that's where landscape becomes a bit difficult, no? Because landscape has often been, and map making as well, has been within our tradition very much one of conquering, of claiming land, through depicting it. You think about Gainsborough's paintings with the landscape behind, which is the claim of the figures that are standing in there. This is our land, we own this. Yeah, and I don't think there's a question of ownership at all in Qiu's work. I don't think it's owning these lands. That's why they're always fantasy places and why they have the body. So I think I totally agree with you, but my resistance in locating it within a Western context is that we immediately reach to a tradition of landscape, which is about conquest, colonialism, and ownership. And that's not where he's coming from. So it feels better to locate it within an idea of tradition and calligraphy for me in order to get over that. Otherwise you have to explain what I've just done in order to get anywhere. And then that's a bit boring because then you're talking in negatives. So
we are out of time. Thank you so much, Charles, for travelling here to make this lecture for us, for bringing these ideas of Qiu Zhijie and the exhibitions you've made with him and our exhibition here, but also for reminding us of the pure magic that can happen between a curator and an artist when you work together for such a long period over so many projects and build such a history and understanding and creativity and new art together. It's been very inspiring. And please join me in thanking Charles Esche.
Thank you.